Types of equalizers. These are the big overall categories of what types of equalizers exist in terms of the architectures. And they're all useful for various things. There's a graphic EQ, a parametric EQ, which is multiband peaking and shelving, and then filters. Most people call a different category. I kind of connect them with parametric EQs because most plugins give you filters and parametric EQ all in one plugin. So let's start with graphic EQs and what they're good for. This is what a graphic EQ is. They take the spectrum and they split it into multi-bands. Sometimes there's 32 bands, sometimes there's 16 bands, sometimes there's 5 bands. And they make foot pedals for guitars that are 5 bands, and I've seen room equalizers in a live stage situation that have 32 bands. Because there's so many sliding faders, what they're really best for is using to compensate for deficiencies in the acoustics of a room. So if I've got a live PA, my speakers are playing in this room, and certain frequencies resonate because of the size of the room and the shape of the room, I can use my graphic EQ and pull out some of the frequencies that are a little too loud in the room or add some frequencies that are not loud enough to compensate. And then once it's set up and it sounds great, or like my home theater system, I've made it sound great. A lot of these graphic EQs, not plugins, but the real thing, the actual analog EQs, they had covers that you would screw on to them so nobody could come along and start moving faders. So you set up your room so it sounds really good, and then you lock it down, and that's how it's going to be. And you've electronically compensated for some of the deficiencies in how you hear something in a specific room, acoustics. That's really a best use for them. It can be used for anything. I mean, you could EQ a guitar with it or a kick drum. It's just very difficult because you've got all these faders to move around. But in general, graphic EQs are, in my opinion, best used to compensate for the acoustics of a sound system in a specific room. For example, if you're in a concert hall, okay, you're singing, right? And you're singing in a big gymnasium. And certain frequencies are really popping out and it doesn't sound that great. They can use the graphic EQs to EQ the sound out of your speakers so that it sounds more lifelike and it compensates for what the room is doing to the sound. When I used to work as a technical engineer for a lot of the major studios in town, I would set up a microphone in the exact listening area that my ears would be if I'm sitting in front of the console. Then we would turn on the big speakers and we would hook up those microphones to an analyzer that would say, oh, this frequency's popping out, this one's not popping out enough. And then we would run pink noise or white noise. So you excite the room at all frequencies, and then you see how the room reacts to it by how the microphones pick up certain frequencies exaggerated and some not exaggerated, some actually diminished. And then you can set up your graphic EQ, and it's a very sensitive job to get it just right, because you got to figure out which frequency you're hearing more of and what your analyzer's telling you versus how it sounds. And there were actually guys in town that just specialized in setting up studio listening rooms to make it sound the best. Those guys got paid an awful lot to set up a room, and they'd take an entire day with all their sophisticated tech gear and come in and sweep the room with frequencies and see which frequencies resonated and so on and how to compensate for it. And those guys were considered specialists that you call to set up your room. And once your room's set up, then you bolt down the graphic EQs so some silly second engineer can't move a fader and ruin it. And then your room actually has a sound. As we discussed before, your ears aren't flat, right? Your ear frequency response is not flat. You've got to peak up at about 2.7K or whatever we discussed because the resonance of your ear canal. I mean, all of these complications, especially when you're listening on big speakers and it turns it up. Do you remember the graph that I showed you where your frequency response of your hearing changes with volume? So all of that is necessary to factor in to what you do to the room, because as you turn up the volume, other frequencies get more excited and multiples of the initial frequencies get excited. Remember when we talked about a room and its resonance, right? If it's this size room, once it hits the back wall, it starts to diminish if we're talking about quiet levels. But when you're talking about loud levels, it can bounce around a lot more and resonate a whole lot longer, and it becomes more problematic. So in control rooms, you go into your Ocean Way recording studio and you've got your big budget to make your album. They've thought this out. They've thought about this in the control room. So you can listen loud, listen quiet, and it retains the same basic frequency content, so you're not confusing yourself. I used to mix at a place called Westlake. I don't know if they still have rooms, but they were extremely famous rooms. They made a lot of major records in them. And those rooms were consistently, they sounded great when you're sitting in the room. And consistently, when I'd take a mix outside of that room and play it in my car, it would be too bottom heavy and too boomy and muddy sounding. And that's because of their electronic compensation to make it sound great in that room. And to me, it took a little bit of learning curve before I knew how it really should sound. And I couldn't get over the top making it sound so great in the control room because it wouldn't sound great in other places. My particular studio that I work in now, I've built in a way that it sounds good but not unbelievable, but it translates. So what you're hearing in my control room is honest. The way that if you go to your car or somebody else's house on their stereo, it should be relatively close to what we were hearing in the studio. That way I have a good judge when I'm mixing as to how to make sure that it'll translate to different places.